Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. Our speaker today is Lauren Nicholas, and the topic is financial predictors and consequences of dementia. Really excited about this. A couple of announcements before we get started and do our formal introduction. The next grand rounds will be December 7th. The speaker is Noelle Marie Javier, a good friend of mine from Mount Sinai, and the topic is LGBTQ plus medicine in older adults. The next journal club will be March 14th, ways away. It'll be virtual, and the presenters will be Sarah Tietz and Hillary Lum. Some other announcements: following today's grand rounds, you'll receive an email with a link to the recording of today's presentation. Also included in the email will be a link to an online evaluation. Please complete that. And please submit questions into the chat for today's presentation at any time during the presentation, and we'll get to them afterwards. To introduce our speaker, Lauren Nicholas is an associate professor in the Division of Geriatrics at the CU Anschutz School of Medicine, right here, part of the core faculty of the Center for Bioethics and Humanities, and has a secondary appointment in the CU Denver Department of Economics. Dr. Nicholas is a health economist whose research focuses on the role of public policy in improving health and healthcare quality for the elderly. She has received numerous research awards, including the National Academy of Social Insurance John Hines Dissertation Award, the Academy Health Article of the Year Award, and the HCUP Most Outstanding Article Award. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Nicholas. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everybody. I'm going to be talking about some of the financial predictors and consequences of dementia in this talk, with sadly no lucrative conflicts of interest from the financial industry, and support from NIA, Social Security Administration, and the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, who all want to be, free of any conflicts of interest and do not share our views of these issues, but graciously funded us. So we'll take it. And this is joint work with lots of folks on the health and retirement side, Micah Baum, Amy Kelly, Jing Lee, Sesmira Matta, Kathleen McGarry, John Skinner, and then on the credit data side, Julie Bynum, Joanne Shu, and Ken Langa. We can blame them for all errors as well. So this talk is going to be sort of smushing a bunch of papers together to kind of talk about a body of research that really came from some of these disturbing anecdotes and news stories about this is one of the earliest articles from Gina Colada in 2010 in the New York Times, Money Woes Can Be Early Clue to Alzheimer's, kind of talking about the Packel family's experience. So she writes, it turns out that Mr. Packel was developing Alzheimer's disease and forgotten how to handle money when she tried to pay their bills. Mrs. Packel, who enlisted the help of a forensic accountant, could not find most of the couple's money. It just disappeared, she said. And so I think we were hearing kind of a growing number of sort of very heartbreaking stories along these lines of families either finding out about dementia in the process of investigating missed payments or existing patients not wanting to turn over control of their finances. And that kind of got us wondering, how common are these situations? Are they bad enough that we could see it in secondary data and financial data and sort of maybe get to the point where we could do something about it? So in this talk, I'm going to be kind of summarizing a few papers that we've already completed in JAMA Network Open, JAMA Neurology, and JAMA Internal Medicine, sort of starting to describe this problem, and then talk about what we're currently doing, trying to move more towards prediction and early detection, and talk about some of the policy levers potentially available to us. And I'm going to try to highlight some of the data sets that we've put together to do this, partly because these data are now here and we should be doing a lot more with them. So I'm hoping that people in the audience might get excited about some of this. And if not, we can just be sort of depressed about some of the sad things that come up in these results. That's the downside of this project is I feel like anytime I talk to somebody about it, they're like, oh yeah, we're totally having that in my family. And that is the part where I think we need to get to prediction and detection and help to reduce some of these consequences. But some of what we've been doing, sort of two types of work, one using survey data, relying on the health and retirement study, which is this amazing, large, nationally representative panel study of older adults. They have very, very comprehensive financial data on assets and debt at the household level, as well as sort of person level financial behaviors, and then difficulties managing money in our typical IADL set of questions. They also do a telephone interview for cognitive status with all respondents who are able to complete their own interview. If you're not able to, for reasons that can include cognition, then a proxy, typically a next of kin, does the interview in your place, and that proxy is also asked questions about your cognition. So these sets of survey questions have been crosswalked to a physician-administered sort of gold standard for a subset of the HRS, and so we're able to identify those with cognitive impairment, non-dementia, and full-on dementia, to look at relationship between cognitive functioning and several financial behaviors. So I'm first going to show you the extent that people with impaired cognition are managing their own money, and then look at sort of asset trajectories before and after cognition is consistent with a dementia diagnosis. So sort of the first scary result is that large numbers of cognitively impaired older adults are still managing their own money. This is more than 70% of those with both cognitive impairment, non-dementia, and full dementia in that top panel. And like in the next panel, we look at sort of given that you are managing your own money, do you also report difficulties with that? And we can see, especially among those with full dementia, more than half who are managing their own money also say they have difficulties with that. Similar proportions to those who are not actually managing their own money. A decent number of people in this situation live alone and don't necessarily have someone else available in the household who could be helping. And also non-trivial shares, including of those who are managing their own money, have some of their savings in what we call risky assets. So things like stocks and mutual funds, where you could have this investment sort of wiped out pretty easily. We also see much more rapid dissaving among those with cognitive impairment, and this starts, and it's a pattern we're going to show you again in the credit data. These financial symptoms really happen prior to cognitive impairment being sort of recognizable on a lot of our standard tests. So this is one of the things that I find most concerning about this whole area of research, is that you and your family may be completely unaware that these cognitive deteriorations have started until after financial losses have already occurred. So we see net worth kind of, these are all sort of relative to the access in all of these is going to be sort of where we cross zero, both in years from developing dementia and sort of relative to average assets among those in our sample. So you'll see that pretty much everyone is below this x-axis, indicating that we're already seeing these deteriorations in wealth. This is obviously an older sample, and we're moving forward in time, so we might expect people to be just spending down their money because that's a nice thing to do in retirement. We would like to think these are all, you know, going on vacation and spoiling grandchildren, but all of these point estimates are also relative to a control group that never develops dementia. So all of the things that are associated with normal aging, deteriorating health are already sort of taken out of these effort coefficients. So this is sort of additional losses that aren't driven just by aging or spending. So we see this drop in net worth starting about 4 years before. No. That is the appropriate reaction. Then
Can everyone who's virtual please mute themselves? Thank you so much.
So kind of similar patterns in financial wealth, which is going to be your bank accounts, stocks, bonds, retirement accounts, anything that is easily quantifiable is cash, sort of further broken out in checking, savings, money market, where here we're seeing declines starting 2 years prior to dementia status, and all of these are generally going to continue over time. Home ownership is also dropping off while Medicaid rates increase starting at time of diagnosis and moving forward, and similar patterns for living in a nursing home. So we don't know whether things like reduced probability of owning a home is due to some of these financial losses and horror stories we worry about, or simply co-occurring health needs that encourage the transition to living in a nursing home. So there's lots of moving pieces with these folks that we try to sort of further disaggregate in other types of financial data. But what we know from the survey data is more than 70% of older adults with survey ascertained cognitive impairment, non-dementia, or dementia report managing their own money. This was 7.4 million older adults in 2018, which I think is a lot of people I'm a little worried about. Both financial wealth and home ownership are declining prior to the emergence of many of these tic symptoms relative to a sample that never develops dementia during the study period. We think healthcare spending accounts for some of this decline, but by no means all of it. And but one of the biggest downsides of survey data is we can't differentiate between you know, are these drops in wealth coming from people enjoying their money while they can? And, you know, the sort of ideal economics life cycle model is you like spend your money as you go, and you would end up, you know, dying just as you've spent down all of your assets and sort of derived maximum enjoyment for that. But there's also the worry that, in fact, you know, you're not doing that. You're falling prey to scams, missed bill payments, bad investments, some of the things that we see in a lot of these anecdotes. And that's sort of problematic for other family members who might need those resources, for patients themselves who can now not spend on sort of health and non-health care needs, and sort of raises some more questions about what's going on with them. So we also use credit report data to get a better handle on dementia-related adverse events. And we do this by taking a 5% sample of all US consumers and others living at their address to identify first single-parent households headed by one of these primary sample members, so that we're going to have almost 2 decades of their quarterly credit history. And we basically have full credit reports, which is everything the credit bureaus know about all of the accounts in your name related to credit. So this is going to be like your credit card bills, if you have a mortgage, if you have a tax lien. And this allows us to focus on some key indicators. I'm going to be talking mostly about any delinquency, which is having a bill that's 30 or more days past due. So this is like your credit card bill comes, you forget to pay it, they send you another one with penalty fees and interest, and try to scare you into paying it. You don't pay it again, then it kicks into 30 days past due. Status. We also look at the credit score, also known as the Equifax risk score in the data that we're using, which is sort of an estimate of how likely you are to repay a loan if it's made to you. A higher score is going to be better. And scores below 660 are known as subprime credit, which means that you're sort of a higher default risk, and lenders should be wary of giving you money. Every credit union has their own proprietary formula, and we don't know exactly what goes into this magic, but you can think of it as sort of a composite indicator of, any bad things happening in your credit profile somewhere are going to contribute to this with various weights that we don't know placed on them, but this is our sort of best summary measure of sort of bad things happening in your financial life. We also look at things like new account openings, where we thought that like if scammers got your social security number and there was identity theft, we might see big spikes in that. We actually don't see a ton of that, so we won't be talking about it much today. I'm mostly including some of these other things that turned out to be less interesting when we studied them, to give you guys an idea of sort of the richness of the data that we have here. Things like large increases in balances if you're suddenly like, one of the articles we read about talked about this woman who, decided she needed a new truck and bought this like $200,000 truck through the miracles of internet shopping, with no idea, why she did it or what happened. But we thought we might see more of those popping up, as well as sort of tax liens and judgments, foreclosures, bankruptcy, things that happen if you're not paying lots of bills. Turns out, and I'll show you some data later, that older adults tend to have like pretty good financial outcomes compared to the rest of us, which is great unless you're a researcher looking for frequency of bad outcomes. So those ended up being sort of less promising. And then we match these credit histories to Medicare claims, so our administrative billing data, allowing us to sort of match this up to a series of variables capturing time from the earliest indication of meeting the chronic condition warehouse, Alzheimer's disease, and related dementias flag. Julie said to remind you guys that you might not like this measure. It is flawed for reasons I think everyone appreciates, but it is basically our only way of getting a signal of dementia in a large enough sample to do this paper. And so we are moving ahead with the caveat that for, it may be sort of catching people late right? So our years may not be as accurate if we classified them. People who are not getting care or not getting diagnosed are going to show up in our normal cognition control group, even though they are actually experiencing dementia symptoms as well. So the only upshot of that is all of these problems are going to sort of bias us towards not seeing a result. And everything I'm going to go on to show you, you can basically think of as a lower bound of kind of how bad things really are. And we have some standard demographic information, and we're going to compare what we see with dementia to some other health conditions that some of which have been tied to financial conditions, some that have this sort of similar slow onset pattern of, the date we see you track it as sort of nebulously tied to when you actually develop the condition. So we'll show you results for heart attack, which is one of the only conditions where there is documented evidence that financial stress can lead to a heart attack. So we might expect to see that move more closely with financial measures. We also look at hip fracture as both a common event that can trigger sort of expensive healthcare utilization, right? You might just forget to pay bills because you're in the hospital and in pain and busy rehabilitating. You may have, especially where we're in the Medicare fee-for-service standpoint, so you may have non-trivial cost sharing for both that hospitalization and subsequent rehab and utilization. And then two conditions that come on more slowly, arthritis and glaucoma. Unfortunately, for sort of statistical purposes, not quite as clinically serious as dementia, but sort of give us another thing to look at. We did a really horrendous process of putting these data sets together in ways that were compliant with all of the restrictions from both the Medicare side and the credit bureau side, neither of which, are compatible at all, even though we were using data, designed for the Federal Reserve, housed at the Federal Reserve, subject to totally different federal requirements that the Medicare data. So don't do something like this early in your career. Maybe don't do it ever. I think we underestimated how terrible it was going to be. But basically relying on a combination of very small areas of geography, census block in most cases, and the best in some ways best guess, but a little better than a best guess of who's living in the same household based on them having the same address. On the credit data side, it comes from the post office. So if you're getting mail at the same address, they think you live together. In the Medicare data, you've registered for benefits using the same address. We did a lot of GIS cleaning that on the CMS side. They just gave us exact addresses, basically written the way people filled out their form. So there's a lot of cleaning that went into that, but that enabled us to identify people who appear to be coupled Medicare beneficiaries versus people who are living by themselves. We drop everyone who is probably in some sort of facility and, appears to have 600 people in their household. So this is probably less good for like people living in apartment buildings. But we end up with, starting with a 5% sample of credit reports and 20% of Medicare beneficiaries, and have to drop millions and millions of people along the way just because we can't match them, which was a little bit depressing. And so We've since received more money and more data and are in the process of rebuilding a much larger data set where we actually started with Social Security numbers and requested the same people in both sides. And while that has also not been as much of a one-to-one match as I would hope, we do have a much larger sample. So think about that when you're thinking about other projects we might do. The kind of good news is, to the extent that you can assess whether we did a good job matching couples. We took people in the health and retirement study where they explicitly sample coupled and singled households, and you know that they're actually attached to the other person that they report is living in their household. Our Medicare couples, the folks that we found, which is the second darkest gray line, sort of exhibit very similar characteristics on sort of what we think of as assortative mating characteristics, which sort of comes from sociology, where people tend to be partnered to those who are sort of demographically similar to them. These are older adults, so the vast majority of identified couples were different sex, some mostly male-female pairs, sort of consistent with the HRS demographics. Most of them were of the same race and within 5 years of age, so sort of matching what we would expect from those couples. And if we compare people who appeared to live in the same address but did not meet our algorithm, which meant they had to also live in the same zip code for several years prior to that. So sort of, if you're married, and most older couples, have been together for a long time and are gonna, move. If you change zip code, you're usually gonna be going with your spouse, unless we're, potentially losing you to a nursing home or something. So when we compare both those who we classified as not being a couple and just sort of drew random pairs of people who lived in the same census tract, both of those groups looked much less like each other than the people we're considering couples. So that was kind of some good verification of our methodology, and I think means that we can hopefully use these groups for studying kind of what happens to healthcare utilization in coupled versus singled households in a much larger data set than some of these survey data sets would allow. So for example, having the presence of somebody else in the house who could help with caregiving or managing money or any of these sort of hard to study in claims data outcomes. So as we mentioned, older adults have sort of disappointingly good financial histories overall. Any delinquency in the quarter, only about 12% of our sample, but you'll see slightly higher in the pre-ADRD, about 13%, jumping to 22% by the time you're post-diagnosis. So this is going to sort of preview some of the things we're going to see. Credit scores, pretty good credit for everybody. And this is because one of the best things you can do for your credit is just have accounts open for a long time. So by the time you are old enough to be in our sample and at risk for dementia, many people have had accounts open for a long time, paid off a house, paid off a car. And so that's going to make you look pretty good. We did not see huge amounts of opening new accounts where we thought we were going to see scams. So we're going to talk less about that going forward, and sort of dropping in the post-dementia phase, sort of similarly for kind of taking on new debt. And where we thought we might see some action in these like tax liens or judgment where, you know, you hear about people losing homes or businesses because they just forgot to make payments. And that was very rare in our sample. So kind of not saying it doesn't happen, but that we were not in a good place to study it because it was sort of insufficiently common. And so we're going to end up with about 4 million observations on 80,000 older adults, since everyone is being assessed quarterly for ideally a very long time. Our sample is going to be older and sicker on average than sort of the full Medicare 5% sample. This is partly by design. We oversampled those with ADRD to make sure that we had sort of a large comparison sample. So 31% are going to have dementia at some point, and allow us to sort of track their financial history in comparison to those never developing. So our first big result is that payment delinquency is at an elevated risk for those who eventually develop dementia relative to the non-dementia sample. And this is starting more than 6 years prior to clinical diagnosis. Missed payments are increasing as we get closer to diagnosis and actually persist. So we were sort of hoping that you'd have some clinical recognition, family might be alerted, somebody would take over, and we actually see things sort of staying elevated. In the post-diagnosis period, we're following people for 4 years post-diagnosis, since many of the sample members will die within those 4 years, and those living sort of more than 4 years are kind of a not weird, but non-representative and smaller group that are harder to make inference from. These results are percentage point changes. So you'll see we're up in the post-dementia period about 4 percentage points more likely to have a missed payment. If you recall from the summary statistics, only 12% of the non-dementia sample, for example, has missed payments in any given quarter. So this is like a third of the non-dementia effect size. So these are really like huge differences in behaviors that are also obviously costly to patients. So the credit score is also sort of picking up these changes starting about 3 years prior to diagnosis. It's declining relative to the average. This is sort of on the first, we were like, oh, this is nice. It's like a single summary statistic that maybe we could use as a quick proxy. However, these changes in score are pretty small in magnitude, right? So even when we get like 2 years out and we're hitting some of these lowest points, it's only like a 5-point change on something that had a mean of like 750, right? And so it's hard to say, oh, people should just look at their credit report every month. And, you know, that 5-point change is, you know, something that could easily be missed and wouldn't really cause alarm. So we found it slightly more useful to look at meeting the subprime credit classification, which is sort of giving this like, if you move from non-subprime to subprime, probably multiple bad things have happened. And so again, we see this starting to be elevated about 2.5 years prior to diagnosis, remaining elevated until that sort of very last 4 years out, and sort of again continuing to get worse post-diagnosis. post-diagnosis. And so while we saw some of the other indicators like the missed payments starting earlier on, developing subprime credit is sort of a more comprehensive indicator of like lots of bad things are happening. And so you can sort of think of this as the accumulation of like, 6 years out, you maybe missed your first bill, and then another 4 years, something else bad happens. And then we start sort of getting into this accumulation of bad events. Okay. Delinquency also sort of gets more severe as cognition declines. So you can see, we see things being like 30 to 90 days past due more frequently in the pre-diagnosis period. Whereas as we move to sort of things that are approaching severe delinquency, 120 or more days past due, that's sort of slightly elevated in the pre-diagnostic period and gets really bad post-diagnosis. So looking at some of these more specific indicators help give us a better idea of where somebody might be in their dementia trajectory. The other sort of alarming result that a reviewer encouraged us to look at is there's an important educational gradient in these results as well. So, we don't know people's individual accounts, but we were able to merge census data at the census tract level, which is sort of think of small neighborhood size. And so people living in areas that had below median education levels of older adults in their census tract experienced much more severe financial consequences. So these are both starting earlier and affecting a larger share of the population. And you see basically the same patterns in subprime credit and payment delinquency. Most financial things we look at sort of move in pretty similar directions. So these are good sort of summary proxies for what's going on globally. And, we don't know if this is because the more educated folks are getting diagnosed earlier and it's being caught, or because they have sort of higher financial literacy, which also moves with education, or if they're kind of sort of better prepared to weather these changes, and maybe they use more auto pay, which really, screws things up if you're looking for forgetting. But we definitely know that this sort of less advantaged group also experiences sort of worse financial symptoms. So the other thing, we've sort of tried to get a delayed diagnosis the best that we can, which you'll probably not love this measure, but we're sort of doing what we can in administrative data, sort of taking advantage of the fact that many first indications of Alzheimer's show up in the context of a hospitalization for something else. So we broke out our sample into those who also had a hospitalization in the year that they were diagnosed, where this might have been found, and those who are not hospitalized, for sure imperfect, but what we have. And we see kind of, again, much worse financial symptoms in this possibly delayed diagnosis group. So they're experiencing elevated rates of payment delinquency for many years prior to the clinical recognition. And it's sort of continuing post-diagnosis and affecting a larger share of the population, right? So about 2 percentage points more likely in this group versus 1 percentage point more likely in the no hospitalization group. If you were worried that this is just a consequence of getting older or getting sicker, our placebo conditions suggest that that is not the case, right? So basically no risk of missed payments relative to an arthritis diagnosis. Folks with glaucoma diagnoses are actually slightly less likely to have missed payments, and we think this is mostly related to socioeconomic status. And if you're going and getting glaucoma screenings, there's probably good things are happening in your life relative to some of these other conditions. Heart attack is one of kind of, as we thought we might see some of these events happening as a result of financial stress. We do see, like, in the 2 years prior to a heart attack, there's starting to be an increase of missed payments, and those continue for 2 to 3 years post event. So certainly dementia is not the only condition that has financial consequences. We see much less with hip fracture, even though, kind of as we talked about, that can be like a very expensive event and something we might worry about, but very distinct in your credit data. So what we've learned so far, these symptoms emerge years prior to diagnoses, can have very large impacts on single person households. Pretty big effects, even though lots of things in our design might lead us to incorrectly not find anything. There's also, and sort of if these things aren't already bad enough, we also note that patients are accumulating all kinds of penalty fees and higher interest rates as a result of these consequences, right? So at the median loan characteristic, which is missing like 3 payments in a year and getting a 15 percentage point increase in your interest rate, because as soon as you miss a payment, the credit card companies really jump on you. So that's going to add an additional $700 to $1,300 in additional losses for persons with ADRD, just sort of due to credit card fees. And this, on its own can be a pretty challenging financial event for older adults with limited incomes. So kind of lots of policy problems that could be addressed, and these financial symptoms are going to be distinct from other health conditions. So the sort of good news is there's some potential for early detection and monitoring. We've done so far just some like very crude models estimating the probability of developing dementia anytime in your life using credit features from just a single point in time. So we picked age 65, 70, and 75 to give us sort of a long ramp up, and we sort of predicted your probability of developing dementia and sort of compared those in the highest value of this score, so the upper 80th percentile, and those sort of below 80th percentile, and you do see much higher rates of expected dementia in the blue bars, which is the above 80th percentile in predicted dementia score. We got almost no additional movement from adding credit or from adding demographic characteristics to the credit data, which is useful from a policy standpoint because credit bureaus aren't supposed to collect demographic characteristics like sex and race, because that can be used for discrimination in lending, which is generally a good policy unless you're trying to match people up or do predictive clinical work in their credit data. But it turned out that the adding those demographics didn't make much of a difference. So this is sort of simultaneously promising because we do see like differentiation between the dementia and the non-dementia group. But if you have the ability to see our axis in the back of the room, this only goes up to about 40% of those who will versus won't develop dementia. Our best scores are like, 40, 30, 38 to 39% of the predicted to develop dementia group actually develops dementia. So this is like not great positive predictive value, not something we would want to give to patients right off the shelf. But we think in our larger sample, we're hoping to do sort of much better prediction and refinement. These are not fancy models. I think there's good potential for beefing that up. And so we are now sort of using this larger data linkage to look at whether coupled households have similar presentation to single households. So it could be that the presence of a second person in the household leads to them taking over and keeping the household out of trouble, or it could be that two people's credit scores are going to be harmed by sort of the financial events of one person. Making these irreparable models, assessing feasibility of predictive models. We are hoping to get to the point where we would want to like test some clinical integration or interest in that, but I think we're still many years from that, and using more detailed claims to examine different sort of diseases that get sort of mushed into this ADRD indicator, sort of getting rid of people with delirium and some of the other things that you wouldn't expect to have financial consequences versus those that do, and sort of trying to figure out what other financial and consumer behavior data can help us with this detection, right? We're really worried about financial fraud, as well as sort of the potential for changing purchase patterns and new account behavior, putting other people in your accounts. Some of the elder abuse indicators I think could all be really informative for sort of building better models and kind of understanding how bad this is. So I think a lot of room to sort of do work in the policy space as well, right? If we can prevent some of these financial losses, that potentially changes the calculus of benefits to early detection. Even if we don't have treatment options, we could have like financial counseling and protection along those lines. We currently don't really have good strategies to recover lost funds, right? If you tell your bank you want to transfer your money to this really nice guy you met at the grocery store who, is your new friend or family member, they have to do it and they can't really recover it. And we can't help you, just, work a few more years, delay retirement when cognitive impairment has already set in. In addition, most of our retirement products are sort of require people to manage complex financial accounts that is not well suited to prevalence of cognitive impairment. So we think about things like prescribing annuities and financial products where you're going to get a guaranteed payment, and you can't as easily mess this up as a consequence of some of these financial mistakes. And then public policy to think about how we protect both financial security and financial data. And if we can get this much signal of your cognitive status from your credit report data, do we need to think about extending kind of health data protections to things that we don't traditionally think of as health data? So lots of interesting sort of data sharing across institutions if you're into that, as well as sort of logistics and ethics questions, not only in the health, but the banking sector. So thanks all, and happy to chat about this.
Thank you, Dr. Nicholas. I think we have a couple questions in the chat. Are there any questions in the audience? Yeah,
Just a few.
just a few.
Lauren, great presentation. Thank you very much. This is super interesting stuff. Do you know Dr. Eric Chess at DU?
I've met him.
Okay, because you are both running parallel on the research that you're doing, and I think maybe being collaborative on, I know he's looking at characteristics of individuals who could be subjects of financial elder fraud, as they age. So that's kind of some interesting components where you're focused on the dementia piece. But yes, happy to do an intro if you would like to reconnect with him. And then the governor's office established the Office of Financial Empowerment a few years ago. They would eat this stuff up. So if you're interested at all on, obviously the policy side, which was your last bullet, but this is the kind of information that they need to have. So happy to do an introduction to that director as well. But great job. Thank you.
Hey, Lauren. It's nice to see actually all of your work put together and have you explain it. One of the things that came to mind as a clinician is that there's this moment for persons with dementia where when we are suspicious of this, we're always thinking like, oh, can we get them sort of a power of attorney? Can we get them a power of attorney? It's curious to know whether or not you've looked in the cohort of persons with dementia, that moment when that power of attorney hits, what happens to the financial, what happens to credit afterwards? And in my head, I can imagine two potential outcomes. One is like you get someone to start spending on services, and then you get asset depletion, but maybe like fewer delinquencies. You could also have the terrible possibility that it is totally the wrong power of attorney and it was assigned to a scammer. And then all of a sudden delinquencies get worse, or you end up with like someone who's favorable. But I was really curious to know, I'm sure you've thought of it, where you're at in terms of that thinking.
Yeah, so we don't know in the credit data if you have power of attorney. So that's one of the downsides of this research design is we basically have to assume that everyone is doing all of their own stuff, and where we're basically getting, some unknown weighted average of people who are managing on their own and people who have good power of attorney and people who have bad power of attorney. I don't think we have a good way of sort of teasing that out. And so one of the things we didn't put in this slide is like a recommendation of what to do, partly because all of the recommendations are kind of not that good. And it is like, what do we have? We have power of attorney, but then we know that like the most common abusers are family members who are sort of given these privileges, and having our recommendation be like, have a good family is highly unsatisfying, right? And certainly not something that you can like tell your patients to do it. I think you either have one or you don't at that point.
Hey, thanks so much. This is great. This makes me think, it makes me wonder, is there a way to look at people who are maybe veterans within this sample and see if there was a power of attorney reassigned, or maybe what some of the financial consequences were there? Because I think we see a lot of kind of, financial incentives potentially for families within who are families of veterans that can sometimes be attached to benefits, but it could be an interesting subsample.
Yeah, and I think we are super interested in doing something like this in the VA context, partly because, there's multiple mental illnesses or impact financial behavior. And so I think there's also potential to sort of expand beyond dementia. And you know so much more about them. I think you saw our data construction slide, and I think the idea of leading that charge through the VA slightly horrifies me, but I would love it if
Me too.
somebody else wants to make that happen. I think our team is super willing and available, but slightly daunted. But you're right that I think that the payoffs would be huge.
I have a comment that's maybe not really a question because I'm not sure there's an answer, but goes back to what Ken said with, powers of attorney, when do they come into play? And I think a lot of times we see in people making bad financial decisions or having issues in judgment there have capacity in other ways. And so we have this kind of, we don't want to do Britney Spears, right? We don't want to take away our patients' autonomy prematurely. And so, where do we go? And like an example, just that, two examples. One, I had a patient who was widowed, moved here to live with family. They worked. She was alone all day, very lonely, and struck up, one of these online, a guy in, who knows where he was. He was in England, and he, she just like $15,000 later. But she, rationalized it. She was, I know this isn't right, but he just makes me feel good. And then, and her daughter was just up in arms, tried to get her phone changed, and she would just go back because she could still use her phone, figured out how to, get back in touch with him. And then through her computer. And then another example I had was when I lived in New York, a woman who we went and did a court case. She had no family. She was spending every time, a solicitor would come in the mail with, write a check for this foundation or that, organization. She would write dutifully a $25 check. They did not, deem her that she did not have capacity. And then finally, 2 years later, when she nearly burnt her apartment down because she had a little space heater and all the mail that she was, doing, lit up the space heater, went back to court, and it was like I didn't even have to testify because they just put her on the stand. And they're like, oh, okay, yeah. So we get in these kind of gray zones. And I think for us, I'm not sure where we go as clinicians and, from the policy standpoint, or, is it time to enact a power of attorney? I don't know. I just wanted to kind of open that for comments.
Yeah, no, I think I totally agree with you that it's, it's this huge gray zone, and we don't want to push people into like losing control of their assets earlier than they want them, but then we also want to like prevent these catastrophic losses. And so I think there's some things, even just like precluding charities from doing some of those repeated diagnoses, precluding car salespeople from selling you extended warranties on cars you can't drive or might not own anymore, right? There's some room for consumer protections that would also help people who don't have dementia. We can think about things like, now banks are required to ask you if you want to name like a trusted contact who would be contacted if you request something crazy. But no one like forces you to name that person. I think banks have some latitude in who they contact. So another policy option could be sort of putting some additional guardrails in there, although I think the scammers would probably learn to be like, oh, send me exactly $999,000 and not, whatever's going to trigger the guardrails. So I don't know. I think we definitely have work to do, but no super easy solution on what makes it better, which is part of what's really depressing about this work. But that's, I think, my co-author, who is a very like strict retirement economist, and stayed in her job with the guaranteed defined benefit pension, because you're like you can't give that up. She is sort of determined to get us sort of prescribing annuities and financial vehicles that could better protect people. And so I think things like that, where you could give your monthly sum away every month, but making it harder to experience like the worst losses could be sort of a good step. Oh.
Yeah, I think unfortunately we're out of time, but I'm worried that my credit score means that I potentially have dementia. Thank you so much, Dr. Nicholas. Thanks, everyone.
I found out like a year into this project that it turned out my like mortgage auto pay had stopped.
Oh, no.
And my credit union, because it was a credit union, they were just paying it. Someone would go in and like make the transfer.
They were doing it
They
for
were
you.
doing it manually.
Oh my gosh.
It happened that it was due on a weekend,
Yeah.
and so nobody was at work
And
to do
nobody
it.
paid.
And then I got this message, and they're like, "Oh, you're like you haven't."
Oh my
I was
God.
like, "No, I'm
Thank you so much.